The aircraft carrier's deck shimmered under the Pacific sun, salt spray misting the air as Admiral Marcus Kell stepped onto the USS Ronald Reagan with the confidence of a man who'd commanded seas for 3 decades. His entourage trailed behind, aides clutching tablets, junior officers straightening their uniforms, but his attention fixed on a solitary figure standing near the island's superstructure. A woman in a worn flight suit, her dark hair pulled back severely, stood with her hands clasped behind her back, watching an FA-18E Super Hornet being prepped on the flight line. Something about her posture struck him as odd, too relaxed for someone in the presence of a SEAL admiral, too composed for the chaos of carrier operations humming around them. Kell had seen that stance before, in generals and warlords, in men who'd survived things that broke others. He approached with a smirk playing at his lips, the kind reserved for moments when rank needed reminding. "You lost, Lieutenant," he called out, his voice carrying over the roar of jet engines spooling up. The woman didn't turn immediately. She finished watching the ordnanceman load an AIM-120 AMRAAM under the Hornet's wing, her eyes tracking the precision of their movements before slowly pivoting to face him. Her flight suit bore no rank insignia on the shoulders, only a name tape that read Thorn, and a patch depicting a black hawk silhouetted against a blood-red moon. Her face was unremarkable at first glance, strong jaw, olive skin weathered by altitude and sun, eyes the color of storm clouds, but something in those eyes made Kell's smirk falter. "Not lost, sir," she replied, her voice flat and professional, carrying none of the deference he expected. Behind Kell, his chief of staff, Commander Brighton, shifted uncomfortably. He'd briefed the Admiral on the Reagan's complement that morning, and something was nagging at him, something he couldn't quite place about this pilot standing before them. "Then what are you doing out here without your squadron?" Kell pressed, stepping closer. He was playing now, enjoying the game of authority, the way younger officers scrambled to explain themselves. "And where's your rank? Regulations clearly state." "I'm waiting for someone, sir," Thorne interrupted, her gaze never leaving his face. There was no challenge in her tone, no insubordination, just a statement of fact delivered with the weight of absolute certainty. The Admiral's jaw tightened. In 30 years, no one interrupted Marcus Kell. Brighton's tablet slipped from his fingers, clattering against the deck. His face had gone the color of old paper. The aircraft carrier's sprawling deck stretched out like a floating city of controlled chaos, but in this moment, the small circle around Admiral Kell had gone peculiarly quiet. The woman, Thorne, stood motionless, her silence more oppressive than any verbal response could have been. Kell felt the first whisper of unease crawl up his spine, that combat-honed instinct that something wasn't right. Brighton had dropped to one knee, scrambling for his tablet, his hands shaking visibly as he swiped through screens with increasing desperation. "Admiral," Brighton's voice cracked slightly, "I think, sir, we should." "Who exactly are you waiting for?" Kell demanded, cutting off his chief of staff, but his tone had shifted, losing its playful edge. Around them, deck crew had begun to slow their work, sensing the tension the way sailors sense a coming storm. An aviation bosun's mate holding a marshalling wand stood frozen mid-gesture, his attention drawn to the confrontation unfolding. Thorne's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in those gray eyes, amusement perhaps, or pity. "My daughter, sir. She's running late from her briefing with CAG." The Commander Air Group, the carrier's air wing commander, someone who didn't brief Nugget pilots. Brighton had gone completely white now, his tablet clutched against his chest like a shield. "Sir," he whispered urgently, but Kell waved him off, his pride overriding his instinct. "Your daughter," the Admiral's laugh came out harsh, mocking. "Let me guess, she's a pilot too, following in Mommy's footsteps." He turned to his gathered staff, seeking validation, but found only uncomfortable stares directed at the deck. "And what's your rank, exactly? Since you seem to think you can just stand around my carrier without proper identification." The question hung in the salt air. Somewhere behind them, an F-35C's engine whined as it powered down. The sound of boots on steel approached multiple sets, moving with purpose. Thorne tilted her head slightly, listening, then returned her full attention to Kell. "Brigadier General, sir, United States Marine Corps." She said it simply, without inflection, as if reporting the weather. The world seemed to tilt. Kell's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Brighton made a small, anguished sound. "Sir, I tried to tell you she's General Thorne. She transferred from CENTCOM last month. She's here for the Joint Task Force briefing. She flew combat missions in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. She has 3 distinguished flying crosses, 2 silver stars," and his voice failed him. The approaching boots belonged to a 4-star general and his security detail. Kell felt his knees weaken, felt the blood drain from his face so rapidly that spots danced in his vision. Brigadier General Evelyn Thorne, the ghost of Kandahar, the woman who'd flown an A-10 Thunderbolt II through a sandstorm to save a surrounded SEAL team, his SEAL team, 7 years ago. The pilot who'd become a legend in special operations circles, who'd killed so many Taliban fighters during one close air support mission that they'd called in a mullah to pray over the battlefield afterward. The woman who'd lost her husband, a Marine infantry officer in Helmand Province, and raised her daughter alone while rising through ranks that broke most men. His legs gave out. He caught himself on a tie-down chain, his polished shoes sliding on the deck, his dignity crumbling like a sandcastle before a wave. "General, I didn't," words failed him. His legendary composure shattered against the rocks of his own arrogance. Thorne watched him impassively, made no move to help, no gesture of reassurance. Behind her, the 4-star general, Lieutenant General Raymond Cortez, Commander Marine Forces Pacific, stopped at a respectful distance, his weathered face carefully neutral, though his eyes glinted with something that might have been satisfaction. "Admiral Kell," Cortez said, his voice carrying the gravel of 3 decades in the Corps. "I see you've met General Thorne. She'll be coordinating our joint air operations for the upcoming exercise." He emphasized the rank, a subtle rebuke wrapped in professional courtesy. Kell managed to straighten, his face now flushed with humiliation, his heart hammering against his ribs. Around them, the deck crew had returned to their work, but conversations would spread through the ship like wildfire, carried from the flight deck to the mess decks to the berthing compartments. Admiral Marcus Kell, SEAL legend, laid low by a single question. Brighton helped him stand fully, but the damage was done. Thorne's expression hadn't changed throughout the entire exchange. No triumph, no anger, just that same flat professional mask that revealed nothing and everything. "Sir," she addressed Cortez, not Kell, "permission to continue my wait." "Granted, General." Cortez turned to Kell, his face now hardening. "Admiral, perhaps we should discuss the chain of command structure for this operation. In my office, now." It wasn't a request. As Kell followed Cortez toward the island, his legs still unsteady, he heard a young voice call out. The voice belonged to a young woman in a pristine flight suit, her rank insignia marking her as a Navy lieutenant, her stride confident as she approached Thorne. They embraced briefly, professionally, but there was warmth there, a connection that transcended military bearing. "Sorry I'm late, Mom," the younger woman said, her voice carrying clearly across the deck. "CAG wanted to discuss the new targeting protocols." She had her mother's eyes, Kell noticed, those same storm-gray eyes that had stared through him minutes earlier. "It's fine, Riley," Thorne replied, and for the first time since the encounter began, something approaching softness entered her voice. "Did you eat?" The question, so mundane and maternal, felt jarring against the backdrop of tactical jets and weapons systems, a reminder that even legends lived ordinary moments between extraordinary ones. Riley Thorne nodded, then noticed the retreating figure of Admiral Kell, noted the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his staff hovered nervously. "Did I miss something?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral in the way of junior officers who sensed political landmines. Her mother's expression flickered just for a moment, allowing a ghost of a smile. "The Admiral and I were discussing rank identification," Thorne said. adjusting her daughter's collar with practiced maternal efficiency. A teaching moment. Riley's eyebrows rose fractionally, but she knew better than to press. She'd grown up in this world, had learned its unspoken rules at her mother's knee, had watched Evelyn Thorne navigate the impossible balance between being a single parent and being a warrior. "He asked about your rank," Riley said quietly, understanding dawning. "Oh no." She glanced toward the island where Kel had disappeared, then back at her mother. "Mom, you could have just—" "He needed to learn," Thorne interrupted gently. "And so do you. What did you learn from watching that exchange?" It was a test, another in the endless series of lessons Evelyn Thorne had woven into her daughter's life since the day Riley's father had been folded into a flag and presented at Arlington National Cemetery. Riley considered, her tactical mind working through the scenario. That assumptions are dangerous. That rank isn't always visible. That respect is earned through competence, not intimidation. Thorne nodded, pride flickering in her eyes. "Good. Now you have a CAP mission in 40 minutes. Walk me through your pre-flight." They moved toward Riley's assigned FA-18F, falling into the familiar rhythm of pilot talk, the technical language that had become their shared vocabulary. Around them, the carrier continued its eternal cycle, launches and recoveries, maintenance and meals, the controlled violence that was naval aviation distilled into routine. In his office, Admiral Kell sat across from General Cortez, the silence between them heavy with unspoken judgment. Through the window, they could see Thorne and her daughter conducting their pre-flight inspection, their movements synchronized, efficient, professional. Cortez finally spoke, his voice devoid of sympathy. "You're familiar with General Thorne's record, I assume." It wasn't really a question. Kell nodded mutely, his throat tight with shame and something deeper, something closer to fear at how close he'd come to catastrophic professional embarrassment. "Then you know what she's done, what she's sacrificed," Cortez continued, leaning back in his chair. "She flew 68 combat missions in Afghanistan. 68. She was shot down twice, walked out of the Hindu Kush both times. She put a 30mm round through a Taliban commander's vehicle from 4,000 feet while taking small arms fire. She brought back birds that should have been scrap metal, kept Marines alive who had no right to survive." He paused, letting each fact land like an artillery shell. "And she did all of it while raising a daughter alone, while grieving a husband who died covering his squad's retreat." Kell stared at his hands, these hands that had held rifles and signed orders and shaken hands with presidents, and found them trembling. "I didn't know she was on the ship," he said weakly, knowing how pathetic it sounded. Cortez's expression could have cut steel. "You should have known. Brighton briefed you this morning. You had the roster. You chose not to read it carefully because you assumed." He let the sentence hang unfinished, more damning in its incompleteness. "I assumed she was junior enlisted, or maybe a junior officer," Kell admitted, forcing himself to meet Cortez's gaze. "I saw a woman in a flight suit without visible rank, and I made assumptions based on—" He stopped, unable to finish, unable to speak aloud the biases that had governed his thinking, that had turned a routine deck encounter into a master class in humiliation. Outside, Thorne and Riley had finished their pre-flight. Riley climbed the ladder into her Hornet's cockpit while Thorne stood back, watching with the eternal anxiety of a parent sending a child into danger, the same anxiety she'd felt every single time since Riley had earned her wings. Admiral Kell had retreated to his personal quarters, bypassing the evening briefing he was scheduled to attend, pleading a sudden onset of what his aide diplomatically termed digestive distress. The truth was simpler and more corrosive. He couldn't face a room full of officers who'd already heard the story, couldn't endure the sideways glances and carefully neutral expressions that would greet him. He sat in the darkness, the only light coming from his laptop screen, and did what he should have done that morning. He read General Evelyn Thorne's personnel file. Each line was a hammer blow. Born in Tucson, Arizona, to a schoolteacher and a crop duster pilot. Joined the Marines at 19, initially as a supply specialist because the combat aviation pipeline hadn't yet opened to women. Waited 3 years, reapplied the moment restrictions lifted, scored in the 99th percentile on every evaluation. Flew AV-8B Harriers first, then transitioned to the A-10 when joint operations put her in Air Force command structures. Married Captain James Thorne, USMC Infantry, in a small ceremony at Camp Pendleton. Gave birth to Riley between deployments, returned to flight status 6 weeks later because they needed pilots more than they needed her to be anything else. Then the deployment that changed everything. Captain Thorne's company had been ambushed in Helmand Province during what should have been a routine patrol. The Taliban had learned patience, had waited until the Marines were spread thin along a river valley before springing their trap with devastating precision. James Thorne had held a position for 40 minutes, allowing his platoon to withdraw, knowing he wouldn't survive it. He'd been awarded the Navy Cross posthumously. Evelyn had been airborne that day, flying CAP over a different sector, and only learned about her husband's death when she landed. She'd taken 2 weeks of leave, buried her husband, held her 7-year-old daughter while she cried, then returned to combat operations. The file noted a psychological evaluation, mandatory after such trauma, that cleared her for duty with a note that read simply, Captain Thorne demonstrates exceptional compartmentalization capabilities and unwavering mission focus. She is fit for immediate return to flight status. What it didn't say, what couldn't be captured in clinical language, was how she'd channeled her grief into something cold and purposeful, how she'd become something the enemy learned to fear. The ghost of Kandahar was born 6 months later. A SEAL team, Kell's team, had been compromised during a high-value target operation in the Kandahar Province mountains. Intelligence had been wrong, the target had been expecting them, and what should have been a surgical strike had become a desperate fighting retreat. They'd called for close air support, but the weather had grounded most aircraft. A sandstorm was rolling in, visibility near zero, winds gusting to 40 knots. Every pilot in theater had looked at the conditions and the target coordinates, and declined the mission as suicidal. Except Evelyn Thorne. She'd launched her A-10 into conditions that violated every safety protocol, had flown into a maelstrom of sand and wind with nothing but instruments and the coordinates of dying men to guide her. The SEALs, pinned down in a dried riverbed, had heard her coming before they saw her, the distinctive sound of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a weapon that fired depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 65 per second. She'd made 3 gun runs, each time disappearing into the sandstorm, each time emerging precisely where she needed to be, walking her fire across Taliban positions with surgical accuracy. When she'd exhausted her ammunition, she'd used her presence as a distraction, flying low and slow, drawing fire away from the SEALs while they made their extraction. She'd taken 14 hits from small arms fire, had lost hydraulics and half her instruments, but she'd kept that A-10 in the air until the last SEAL was aboard the rescue helicopter. Then, and only then, had she limped back to base, landing with fuel reserves measured in minutes rather than hours. Kell had written the commendation for her Silver Star himself. He'd met her briefly during the award ceremony, had shaken her hand and thanked her for his team's lives, had looked into those storm-gray eyes and seen something that unsettled him even then, a void where fear should have lived, a perfect calm born from having already lost everything that mattered. He'd forgotten her face, he'd forgotten her name, he'd remembered the mission, told the story at a dozen briefings, used it as an example of exceptional courage, but he'd somehow erased the woman at the center of it, had filed her away as just another pilot doing their job. Now, sitting in his darkened quarters, Admiral Marcus Kell felt the full weight of his failure. Not just the embarrassment of mistaking a general for a junior officer, but something more profound. The realization that he'd spent 3 decades in uniform without truly seeing the people who served beside him, without recognizing that heroism wore many faces and walked many paths, some of them carrying burdens he couldn't imagine. On the flight deck, Riley Thorne's FA-18F launched into the dusk, afterburners painting the sky orange and red. Evelyn Thorne watched until the aircraft was just a point of light against the darkening horizon, then turned away, her expression settling back into its professional mask. She had reports to file, briefings to prepare, the endless administrative weight that came with stars on her collar. But for just a moment, standing in the wind and jet wash, she allowed herself to be just a mother watching her daughter fly into danger, allowed herself to feel the fear she couldn't afford to show. The sky was her cathedral and her battlefield, the place where she'd lost everything and found purpose, where she'd become something other than Evelyn, other than mom, other than a widow. In the sky, she was pure function, pure capability, pure will made manifest in aluminum and titanium and burning fuel. That's what people like Kell didn't understand, that women like her hadn't demanded respect, hadn't fought for recognition. They'd simply flown the missions no one else would fly, had survived the unsurvivable, had carried impossible weights with quiet competence until the world had no choice but to notice. The next morning arrived with the gray promise of Pacific dawn, the carrier cutting through moderate seas, its massive hull absorbing swells that would have tossed smaller vessels like toys. Admiral Kell stood on Vulture's Row, the observation platform overlooking the flight deck, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He'd slept poorly, his dreams filled with sandstorms and falling aircraft and accusing gray eyes. Below him, the morning flight operations began, the carefully choreographed dance of jets and crew that happened every day, thousands of small decisions and actions that kept a carrier functioning. General Thorne was already on deck, he noted, conferring with the air boss, pointing at something on a tablet. She was dressed in the same worn flight suit, still without visible rank insignia on her shoulders, though now Kell noticed the small stars embroidered on her chest, partially hidden by her survival vest. She'd chosen not to make herself obvious, he realized, had deliberately maintained a low profile not out of modesty, but out of a warfighter's instinct. Rank made you a target, made you political, made you something other than a pilot. "Sir," Brighton's voice interrupted his thoughts. His chief of staff looked haggard, as if he too had spent the night wrestling with demons. "General Cortez wants to see us both. Conference Room Delta 0800. There was sympathy in Brighton's tone now, the kind that came after a superior officer had been humbled, after the hierarchy had been disrupted. Kell simply nodded, finished his cold coffee, and followed Brighton into the island's interior. The conference room was sparse, functional. A long table, chairs bolted to the deck, displays on the walls showing various tactical scenarios. Cortez was already there, along with Thorne and several other senior officers Kell didn't immediately recognize. He took his assigned seat, feeling like a junior officer called before a review board, and waited for the hammer to fall. It didn't fall the way he expected. Cortez opened the briefing by outlining the Joint Task Force exercise, a complex scenario involving simulated peer-adversary threats, distributed maritime operations, and integrated air defense networks. It was the kind of exercise that required seamless coordination between services, between platforms, between the old guard and the new generation. "General Thorne will be coordinating all fixed-wing assets," Cortez said, gesturing to her. Her experience in complex combat environments makes her uniquely qualified for this role. Thorne stood, moved to the display, and began walking through the operation with the confidence of someone who'd done this countless times. Her briefing was economical, precise, devoid of the ego that often infected such presentations. She spoke of weapons envelopes and threat rings, of timing and coordination, of backup plans and contingencies. She referenced specific missions from her combat deployments, using real-world examples to illustrate tactical principles. The room listened, with the intensity of professionals recognizing expertise. Kell found himself leaning forward despite his discomfort, found his tactical mind engaging with her concepts. She was brilliant, not just competent, but genuinely innovative, seeing connections between platforms and capabilities that others missed. When she discussed a particular scenario involving saturated air defenses, she referenced a mission she'd flown over Syria, how she'd used terrain masking and timing to put ordnance on target when every other option had been exhausted. She didn't glorify it, didn't make herself the hero, just presented it as data, as lessons learned in blood and fire. "Questions?" she asked, her gaze sweeping the room. It landed on Kell for just a moment, and he saw no anger there, no resentment, just professional inquiry. He cleared his throat, forced himself to speak. "General, the timing on the northern package seems aggressive. What's your confidence level on the coordination?" She considered his question seriously, didn't dismiss it, didn't use it as an opportunity for payback. 70%, Admiral. You're right to flag it. The margin for error is thin. But if we can execute it, we demonstrate a capability that peer adversaries aren't expecting. We show we can mass effects rapidly even against sophisticated defenses. She paused, then added, "That said, if you have concerns, I'm willing to adjust the timeline. This is a joint operation, and I value your input." The statement hung in the air, an olive branch extended not with fanfare but with quiet professionalism. Kell felt something unknot in his chest, felt the beginning of what might become redemption. "No," he said slowly, "I think you're right. Let's keep the aggressive timeline. My SEALs can support the insertion sequence. We'll make it work." Thorne nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement between professionals, and moved on to the next phase of the brief. The exercise began 3 days later, with ships dispersing across 1,000 square miles of ocean, taking up positions in a complex geometry of mutual support and overlapping fields of fire. The Reagan launched aircraft in waves, F-35CS for air superiority, FA-18s for strike missions, EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare, and E-2D Hawkeyes for airborne early warning. General Thorne commanded from the CDC, the Combat Direction Center, surrounded by displays showing air tracks and data links, her voice calm and methodical over the tactical frequencies. Admiral Kell observed from a corner station, officially supervising the special operations component but really just watching her work. She orchestrated dozens of aircraft like a conductor leading a symphony, her calls precise and economical. "Striker 2-3, you're 30 seconds hot on your timeline. Accelerate to buster speed and cut corner Alpha 3. The pilot acknowledged, his FA-18 pushing through the sound barrier. "Wraith flight, hold your pattern. You'll commit on my mark, not before." The scenario escalated according to plan, simulated enemy aircraft, surface-to-air missile systems, the digital chaos of modern warfare compressed into training exercise parameters. Thorne adapted in real time, shifting assets, exploiting gaps, covering vulnerabilities. When an unexpected development emerged, a Red Force submarine unexpectedly entering the operating area, she didn't hesitate. "Hunter 2-1, break off your strike package. Prosecute submarine contact bearing 09 or 5, range 40 nautical miles." The P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft acknowledged and vectored toward the target. Meanwhile, she redirected other assets to cover the gap, maintaining offensive pressure while responding to the new threat. It was the kind of multi-dimensional problem-solving that separated good officers from exceptional ones, and she made it look effortless. "She's extraordinary," Brighton murmured beside Kell, speaking what Kell was thinking but couldn't say aloud. On screen, the exercise reached its climax. The northern package Kell had questioned pushed through a simulated air defense network, putting ordnance on target with less than 5 seconds deviation from planned time on target. It was textbook perfect, a demonstration of coordination and capability that would be studied in staff colleges. When the exercise concluded, the CDC erupted in controlled celebration, handshakes and fist bumps, the release of tension that came after hours of concentration. Thorne simply nodded, spoke briefly to her staff, then removed her headset and stepped away from the console. She looked tired, Kell noticed, the kind of fatigue that went deeper than lack of sleep, the weight of responsibility that came with making decisions where practice rounds and live ones blurred together in muscle memory. He intercepted her before she could leave. "General, a word." She paused, turned, her expression neutral. They moved to an empty corner of the CDC, away from the celebrating crews. Kell took a breath, forced himself to meet those storm-gray eyes. "I owe you an apology, a real one. What happened on the flight deck?" Was a reminder that assumptions are dangerous, she interrupted, but her tone was gentler now, less remote. "We both learned something, Admiral. You about making judgments without information. Me that my low profile probably goes too far." She gestured at her flight suit, still lacking obvious rank insignia. "I forget that visibility matters, that people need to see examples." "Why do you hide it?" Kell asked, genuine curiosity overriding protocol. "The stars, the rank, you earned them. Why not wear them?" Thorne was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. "Because the moment you put stars on your shoulders, you stop being a pilot and start being a symbol. People stop seeing what you do and start seeing what you represent. And I'm not ready to be just a symbol." She focused back on him. "I'm still a warfighter, Admiral. I still need to be able to walk onto a flight line and talk to crew chiefs and pilots without rank getting in the way." It was the most personal statement she'd made, and Kell recognized the gift of it. "Your daughter," he said. "Riley, she flies like you." Thorne's expression softened fractionally, the maternal pride she tried to suppress breaking through. "She's better than I was at her age, more technically precise. I was always too aggressive, too willing to push limits." A pause. "She has her father's patience." The mention of her late husband created a moment of silence. Kell remembered reading about Captain James Thorne, about his last stand in Helmand Province. "I'm sorry," he said, inadequate words for inadequate understanding. "I read about what happened, what he did." "He did his job," Thorne replied, her voice steady but carrying undertones of old pain that would never fully heal. "Just like I do mine, just like Riley does hers. We serve, Admiral. That's what we signed up for. The cost is high sometimes, but the alternative is higher." She straightened, professional distance reasserting itself. "Was there anything else, sir?" Kell shook his head, recognizing dismissal when he heard it. She nodded once and departed, leaving him standing in the CDC, surrounded by screens showing aircraft returning to their carriers, the exercise complete, the day one. But his education, he realized, was just beginning. That evening, the Reagan's wardroom hosted a dinner for the senior officers involved in the exercise, a rare moment of relative formality in the controlled chaos of carrier operations. Admiral Kell attended, as required, though he still felt the residual sting of humiliation whenever he caught certain looks from his peers. General Thorne arrived precisely on time, and Kell noticed immediately that she'd changed her flight suit for a service uniform, the stars on her shoulders now prominently visible, ribbons stacked on her chest in a silent testament to decades of service. She'd listened to his question about visibility, he realized. She'd made herself obvious for him or for others who needed to see it. The gesture surprised him. She didn't seem like someone who responded to criticism or adapted to others' comfort. But then, maybe that was another lesson, another example of leadership that manifested in unexpected ways. The dinner proceeded with the usual military formality, toasts and brief speeches, the ritual acknowledgement of service that bound them all together. When General Cortez raised his glass to toast the successful exercise, he made particular note of Thorne's coordination efforts. "To General Thorne," he said, "who reminded us all that excellence has no gender, no timeline, and no patience for mediocrity." The room erupted in "hear, hear," and Thorne nodded acknowledgement, her expression composed but something warm flickering in her eyes. Kell found himself seated across from her during the meal, fate, or careful planning positioning them together. They spoke little at first, both focused on the food, surprisingly good for shipboard fare, and the low conversations around them. But eventually, as dessert arrived and the formal tension eased, Kell found himself asking the question that had been nagging him since reading her file. "Why the Marines?" he said, keeping his voice low, conversational. "With your scores, your capabilities, you could have gone anywhere. Air Force would have fast-tracked you. Navy would have put you in command positions years earlier. Why choose the service that made you fight harder for every opportunity?" Thorne set down her fork, considered the question with the seriousness she seemed to bring to everything. "Because they were the hardest on me," she said finally. "Because I knew that if I could make it as a Marine aviator, no one would ever be able to say I didn't earn it. No one could attribute my success to anything except capability." She paused, then added, "And because my father was a Marine." Korea, 1951. He flew Corsairs off carriers, came back with malaria and nightmares, and an absolute certainty that the Corps was the finest organization humans had ever created. I grew up hearing those stories. "He must be proud," Kell said, then immediately regretted it as he saw her expression shift, saw the old grief surface. "He died before I got my wings," Thorne said quietly. "Heart attack at 62, too many years of suppressed stress catching up. My mother said he knew I'd make it. He left me his flight jacket, his logbook, and a note that said, 'Fly better than I did.'" She smiled, but it was sad, haunted. "I've tried, Admiral, I've really tried." Kell felt something crack in his chest, some last resistance to fully understanding this woman across from him. She wasn't just a general, wasn't just a pilot, wasn't just a widow or a mother. She was all those things and more, a complex intersection of duty and loss and determination that had forged her into something rare and valuable and breakable despite her strength. "You've succeeded," he said, and meant it. "Your father would be proud. Hell, we're all proud, even if some of us are slow to show it." The admission cost him, but it felt necessary, felt like the beginning of something that might become understanding. Thorne met his gaze, held it, and for the first time since that encounter on the flight deck, she smiled fully, a genuine expression that transformed her face from stern to beautiful. "Thank you, Admiral. That means more than you know." They finished their meal in companionable silence, two warriors separated by service and experience but united by the weight of command, by the knowledge that leadership was often lonely and always consequential. Later, after the dinner had concluded and officers had dispersed to their various duties or quarters, Kell found himself back on Vulture's Row, staring at the night sky. The stars were extraordinary out here, away from land-based light pollution, a vast tapestry that reminded him why he joined the Navy in the first place, to be part of something bigger, to serve something beyond himself. He thought about Thorne, about her journey, about the battles she'd fought that had nothing to do with enemy aircraft or Taliban fighters. She'd fought against assumption and prejudice, against grief and loss, against a system that hadn't been designed for women like her but had been forced to adapt or fail. And she'd won, not through anger or politics or demands for special treatment, but through pure competence, through flying the missions others wouldn't fly, through being undeniable in her excellence. That's what Kell had failed to understand on the flight deck, that women like Evelyn Thorne didn't need his condescension or his mockery or his assumptions. They needed him to get out of their way and let them work, to judge them on their capabilities rather than his preconceptions. A figure approached from the shadows, Brighton, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might want this, sir," he said, offering one. Kell accepted gratefully and they stood together in silence, watching the ocean slide past beneath them. "I should have briefed you better," Brighton said eventually. "About General Thorne. I knew she was aboard, knew her history. I should have made sure you knew." "Not your fault," Kell replied. "I should have read the briefing materials. I was arrogant, assumed I didn't need to. That's on me, not you." He sipped the coffee, let the heat ground him. "She's remarkable, isn't she? Not just skilled, but something more. Something that can't be taught." Brighton nodded. "I've been reading about her deployments, sir. The things she's done. It's not just combat, it's how she's mentored younger pilots, how she's changed doctrine, how she's made everyone around her better. That's rare. That's the kind of officer that changes institutions." He paused, then added carefully, "That's the kind of officer we should be learning from, not mocking on flight decks." The rebuke was gentle but clear. Kell absorbed it, nodded. "Agreed, So what do I do now? How do I fix this? You don't fix it, Brighton said. You can't unring that bell, but you can learn from it, change because of it. You can make sure the next time you encounter someone who doesn't fit your expectations, you pause before judging. You can be better, sir. That's all any of us can do. It was simple wisdom, the kind that seemed obvious once spoken but remained elusive in practice. Kell finished his coffee, felt the caffeine kick mingling with exhaustion and revelation. She's teaching a class tomorrow morning. Flight operations in contested environments. I'm going to attend. Brighton's eyebrows rose. Sir, that's for junior and mid-grade officers. Your presence might remind them that rank doesn't excuse ignorance, Kell interrupted. Might show them that learning is never finished, that pride is the enemy of competence, and it might just teach me something I desperately need to learn. He handed back the empty cup. Inform my staff. Clear my morning schedule. I'll be in that classroom and I'll be taking notes. Brighton smiled, the first genuine smile Kell had seen from him in days. Aye, sir. I'll make it happen. As he walked away, Kell remained on Vulture's Row for another hour, watching the stars wheel overhead, thinking about second chances and the hard work of becoming better than you were. Below him, somewhere in the carrier's vast interior, General Evelyn Thorne was probably reviewing tomorrow's lesson plan, or writing emails to her daughter, or simply trying to steal a few hours of sleep before the cycle began again. She'd moved on from their encounter, had already relegated it to the category of minor annoyances in a career full of significant challenges. But Kell hadn't moved on, couldn't move on. He'd been changed by it, marked by the encounter in ways that would take years to fully understand. And maybe, he thought, that was the point. Maybe humiliation was sometimes necessary, sometimes the only tool that could break through ego and force growth. General Evelyn Thorne had taught him more in 5 minutes on a flight deck than most officers had taught him in 30 years, and the lesson was still unfolding, still revealing new dimensions. He looked up at the stars again, those eternal witnesses to human struggle and triumph, and silently thanked her for caring enough to let him fail, and for being professional enough to let him learn from it. The classroom was located deep in the carrier's structure, a converted space that served multiple purposes depending on the ship's needs. When Admiral Kell arrived the next morning, 15 minutes early as was his habit, he found it already half full with officers ranging from Navy lieutenants to Marine Corps captains, all chatting quietly while reviewing notes on tablets. His entrance caused a ripple of surprise. Backs straightened, conversations paused, the instinctive response to flag officer presence. He waved them back to ease, took a seat in the rear corner, and opened his own tablet to a blank note-taking page. General Thorne arrived exactly on time, not a second early or late, carrying a simple leather portfolio and a cup of coffee. She surveyed the room, her gaze pausing fractionally when she noted Kell's presence, but her expression revealed nothing. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying easily without needing to raise it. "Today we're discussing flight operations in contested environments, specifically how to maintain offensive capability when faced with near-peer or peer adversary air defense systems. I'm going to draw heavily from actual operations I've flown in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, so consider this less of a lecture and more of a tactical debrief." She moved to the display, pulled up a map showing the Syrian coast, and began walking through a specific mission. August 14, 2018. Target was a command and control node near Latakia, embedded in a civilian area, protected by an S-300 battery and multiple short-range systems. Coalition intelligence indicated the node was coordinating attacks against Kurdish positions. The mission was deemed critical but high risk. The air defense network had already shot down 2 drones in the previous week, and Syrian air defense crews had been trained by Russian advisors. The room leaned forward, fascinated. Thorne continued, her narration precise and clinical. The challenge was timing and approach vectors. Direct approaches were suicide. The S-300 has an engagement envelope of approximately 200 kilometers, more than sufficient to cover the target. So we went low, using terrain masking from the mountains along the coast, approaching from an unexpected vector over water. 4 aircraft, 2 strikers, 2 support with electronic warfare capabilities. She pulled up targeting footage, grainy green-tinted imagery that showed the approach from a pilot's perspective. Kell recognized the discipline it took to fly that low, that fast, with mountains rising on one side and a dark ocean on the other, with every radar in the region searching for you. The critical moment came here, Thorne said, pausing the footage. We'd reached our launch point, but the Growlers reported that the S-300 had gone active, started searching. We had maybe 30 seconds before they locked us up. So we had a choice: abort and lose the target, or push through and hope our countermeasures held. We pushed through, she said simply. Designated the target, employed our weapons, then went defensive immediately. Both strikers took evasive action. The Growlers lit up the entire electromagnetic spectrum with jamming, and we egressed at max speed. The S-300 launched. We could see the missile contrails. But the combination of jamming, countermeasures, and evasive maneuvering defeated the shot. Target was destroyed. All aircraft returned safely. The room was silent, absorbing the reality of the mission, the split-second decisions that separated success from catastrophe. Now, Thorne said, her tone shifting from narrator to instructor, what did we do right and what did we do wrong? Don't be shy, this is a learning environment. I want your tactical assessment. A Navy lieutenant raised her hand. Ma'am, the approach was brilliant, using terrain masking against a system designed for high-altitude threats. But pushing through when the S-300 went active seems incredibly risky. Was there consideration for aborting? Thorne nodded, pleased with the question. Absolutely. The mission commander, me, had abort authority and exercised judgment that the target value outweighed the increased risk. But that's where experience and intuition intersect with tactical calculation. I'd flown against S-300s before, understood their limitations, knew our countermeasures were effective. A less experienced pilot might have aborted, and that would have been the correct call for them. This is where standardized procedures meet individual capability. Another officer, a Marine captain, spoke up. General, how did you manage the stress? That decision point with missiles potentially inbound. How do you maintain clarity? It was the question they all wanted to ask, Kell realized, the human question beneath the tactical one. Thorne's expression softened slightly. You compartmentalize. You train so extensively that the mechanical aspects of flying become automatic, freeing your conscious mind to process tactical problems. And you really accept that you might not come home. Once you've made peace with that reality, fear becomes manageable. It's still there. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't terrified during that mission, but it doesn't control you. She paused, then added quietly, and you remember who you're fighting for. My daughter was 9 years old when I flew that mission. Every weapon I employed, every risk I took, was to create a world where she could grow up safer. That focus, that purpose, cuts through fear. The room was absolutely still. Kell found himself writing rapidly, capturing not just the tactical lessons but the leadership wisdom woven through Thorne's words. She continued the class for another 90 minutes, walking through multiple scenarios, taking questions, challenging assumptions, and consistently demonstrating the kind of operational expertise that could only come from doing the job at the highest levels. When she dismissed the class, officers lingered, forming a small queue to ask individual questions. Kell waited patiently, watching her interact with each one. She gave every question serious consideration, never rushed, never dismissed concerns as trivial. When the last officer departed, Kell approached. General, thank you for allowing me to observe. That was exceptional. Thorne began gathering her materials, didn't look at him directly. You didn't need my permission, Admiral. The class is open to any officer who wants to attend. But there was no hostility in her voice, just statement of fact. Kell pressed forward, needing to say what he'd come to say. I want to apologize again properly. Not just for the flight deck, but for everything it represented. The assumptions, the casual disrespect, the failure to see you clearly. You deserved better, and I'm genuinely sorry." Stop packing turned to face him fully. Her storm-gray eyes searched his face, looking for sincerity or obligation, finding apparently enough of the former. "Apology accepted, Admiral, and for what it's worth, I understand. You're not the first officer to misjudge me, and you won't be the last. The uniform, the rank, they don't automatically convey the full picture of a person." She slung her portfolio over her shoulder. "But you're here learning, trying to do better. That counts for something." "That counts for a lot, actually." "I read your file," Kel said. "After our encounter, I read about Kandahar, about what you did for my team. I don't think I ever properly thanked you." "You wrote the Silver Star citation," Thorne replied. "You thanked me then, but you'd forgotten, hadn't you? Forgotten my face, my name. You remembered the mission, but not the person." There was no accusation in her voice, just observation. Kel felt his face flush. "Yes, I'm ashamed to admit it, but yes. The mission became a story I told, and you became abstract. A pilot who did something extraordinary, but not a real person with a name and a face and a life." "That's honest," Thorne said. "I appreciate honesty." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Admiral, can I tell you something? Off the record, just between two officers who have been doing this too long." Kel nodded, curious. "I didn't fly that mission in Kandahar for glory or recognition. I flew it because SEALs were dying and I was the only pilot willing to try. But afterward, when the awards came and the story spread, something shifted. I became the female pilot who, as if my gender was the most interesting thing about what happened. Not my skills, not my judgment, not my experience, my gender. And that's exhausting, Admiral. It's exhausting to be constantly reduced to a demographic category, to have every achievement qualified by what you are rather than what you do." She held his gaze, making sure he understood. "So when you saw me on that flight deck and made assumptions based on my gender and apparent lack of rank, you were participating in a pattern that's followed me my entire career. You weren't unique. You weren't especially bad. You were just one more example of a system that sees women in uniform as anomalies rather than professionals. That's what hurt, Admiral. Not the personal disrespect. I've got thick skin. But the reminder that even after all these years, after all these missions, I still have to prove myself to every new commander I encounter." Kel felt the full weight of her words, felt the cumulative burden she carried that he'd never had to bear. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, "except that you're right and I'll try to do better, not just with you but with every officer I encounter." Thorne smiled, a genuine expression tinged with fatigue. "That's all any of us can do, Admiral. Try to be better than we were yesterday." She departed then, leaving Kel alone in the classroom with his thoughts and his notes, and his growing understanding that leadership was far more complex than he'd ever imagined. The joint exercise concluded 3 days later with a final briefing that highlighted successes and identified areas for improvement. Admiral Kel presented the Special Operations component, General Thorne covered air operations, and various other commanders addressed their domains. The overall assessment was positive. The task force had demonstrated capability against simulated peer adversary threats, had proven that different services could integrate effectively under pressure. But the real lessons Kel was learning happened in the margins, in the small interactions that occurred when cameras weren't rolling and reporters weren't present. He'd been watching Thorne carefully over the final days, observing how she interacted with junior officers, how she corrected mistakes without crushing spirits, how she gave credit generously and accepted blame when things went wrong. She was, he realized, the kind of officer that mentorship manuals described but rarely captured, someone who led through example and competence rather than charisma or authority. On the final night before ships dispersed back to their home ports, Kel found Thorne on the flight deck at dusk, watching the last recovery of the day. He approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt her contemplation. "Mind if I join you, General?" She glanced over, nodded. "Free country, Admiral. Free deck anyway." They stood in companionable silence as an F-35C executed its landing, the controlled crash that passed for carrier aviation. the arresting wire catching the aircraft and bringing it to a violent stop in less than 300 feet. The deck crew swarmed immediately, chains and chocks, the eternal dance of naval aviation. "I never get tired of watching that," Thorne said quietly. "The precision, the teamwork, the absolute necessity of everyone doing their job perfectly. It's poetry in its way." "You miss flying," Kell observed. She nodded slowly. "Every single day. Command has its rewards, but nothing compares to having a stick in your hand, making the aircraft do what you want it to do. That's pure." She paused, then added, "But I'm needed here doing this, so I accept it." "Your daughter flies your old routes," Kell said. "Does that help, living vicariously?" Thorne's expression complicated, a mix of pride and worry. "It helps and it terrifies me. Every time Riley launches, I'm proud of her skill and terrified of the 100 things that can go wrong. Hydraulic failures, bird strikes, bad fuel, enemy fire. I know too much, Admiral. I've seen too many good pilots not come home. So I watch her fly and I pray to a God I'm not sure I believe in anymore, and I try to trust that I trained her well enough to survive." It was the most vulnerable statement she'd made, this admission of fear and doubt. Kell felt honored by it, felt the weight of her trust in sharing it. "She's extraordinary," he said. "I've been watching her fly. She has your discipline, your precision. If anyone's going to come home safe, it's her." "My husband was extraordinary too," Thorne replied, her voice going distant. "Best infantry officer I ever knew, smart, capable, beloved by his Marines. He did everything right in Helmand Province, made all the correct tactical decisions, and he still died because sometimes capability isn't enough. Sometimes the war doesn't care how good you are." She turned to face Kell fully. "That's the truth no one wants to acknowledge, Admiral. That we can be excellent, can do everything right and still lose, still break, still die. And we ask people to serve anyway, to take those risks anyway, because the alternative is surrendering to chaos." "Is that what you tell Riley?" Kell asked. "When she asks about her father?" "I tell her that her father died doing something that mattered, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. I tell her that his sacrifice bought time for his Marines to escape, that 30 men went home to their families because James Thorne chose to stay. And I tell her that every day she puts on this uniform, she honors his memory by being worthy of it." Thorne's voice cracked slightly, the first time Kell had heard any emotional break in her composure. "And then I lie awake at night terrified that I'm sending her down the same path, that I'm so committed to this institution that I can't see I'm sacrificing my daughter to it." Kell had no response, no wisdom adequate to that fear. So he simply stood beside her, another parent who understood the specific terror of watching children walk into danger. They remained there as the sun finished setting, as the deck lights came on, as the carrier transitioned from day operations to night routine, and something passed between them. Not friendship exactly, but mutual recognition, the understanding between two people who'd given everything to service and were still trying to figure out if it had been worth it. Eventually, Thorne straightened, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Thank you for listening, Admiral. I don't usually," she trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Kell nodded. "Any time, General, truly. If you ever need to talk about anything, my door is open." She smiled, sad and knowing. "That's a generous offer from someone I humiliated on this very deck a week ago." Kell laughed, surprising himself. "You didn't humiliate me, General. You educated me. There's a difference, and I'm grateful for the lesson even if it hurt my pride." "Pride's overrated anyway," Thorne said, and for a moment the weight seemed to lift from both of them. The shared absurdity of their situation, two senior officers, standing on a carrier deck, discussing vulnerability and fear like ordinary humans rather than instruments of military power. They parted ways shortly after, returning to their separate duties, but Kell carried the conversation with him, turned it over in his mind during the following days as ships dispersed and personnel returned to regular deployments. He thought about General Evelyn Thorne often, about her journey, about the prices she'd paid for excellence. about the daughter following in her contrails. And he thought about his own career, his own assumptions, the ways he'd failed to see clearly because seeing clearly would have required questioning comfortable narratives. A month later, back at his headquarters in San Diego, Admiral Kell received a package with a Marine Corps return address. Inside was a book, a collection of oral histories from female military pilots spanning from World War II through the present. A handwritten note was tucked inside the cover. Admiral Kell, thought you might find this interesting. These are the stories I grew up reading, the women who made my career possible. Maybe they'll provide context for why representation matters, why visibility matters, why your words on that flight deck mattered more than you knew. With respect, Bjen Thorne, USMC. Kell spent that evening reading the histories, stories of women who'd flown bombers and fighters and helicopters, who'd broken barriers and paid prices, who'd been dismissed and underestimated, and had persevered anyway. He read about Jacqueline Cochran and the WASPs of World War II, about the women who'd served in Vietnam, about the slow, grinding progress toward equality that had taken decades and cost so much. And he understood, finally and completely, that General Thorne wasn't an anomaly or an exception. She was part of a continuum, a legacy of women who'd refused to accept limitations, who demanded the right to serve and then proven themselves worthy of it. He wrote her back, a short note acknowledging the book and thanking her for the education. He told her about policy changes he was implementing in his command, about training he was mandating on unconscious bias, about his commitment to ensuring that the next generation of officers wouldn't repeat his mistakes. He didn't know if it would make a difference, if one admiral's conversion would ripple through a culture that resisted change with the momentum of tradition. But he tried, because General Evelyn Thorne had taught him that trying was enough, that growth was possible, that even old warriors could learn new wisdom if they had the humility to admit they needed teaching. 6 months later, Admiral Kell attended a change of command ceremony at Marine Corps Air Station Miramar. General Cortez was retiring, and his replacement was being formally installed. The ceremony was standard speeches and salutes, the passing of colors, the ritual acknowledgement of transition. But at the end, General Cortez did something unusual. He called General Thorne forward and presented her with a ceremonial saber, the kind given to officers who'd made exceptional contributions. "This officer," Cortez said, his voice carrying across the assembled formation, "represents everything we aspire to be as Marines. She has flown in combat more than any active-duty pilot in any service. She has mentored dozens of officers who have gone on to positions of significant responsibility. She has broken barriers not through demands or politics, but through undeniable competence and unwavering dedication." When the history of military aviation in the early 21st century is written, General Evelyn Thorne's name will feature prominently, not as a footnote about gender integration, but as an example of excellence, period. The formation erupted in applause, a sustained ovation that went on for nearly a minute. Thorne stood at attention, accepting the honor with her characteristic composure, but Kell, watching from the audience, saw moisture in her eyes, saw the emotional armor crack just slightly. When the ceremony concluded and the reception began, Kell made his way through the crowd to her side. "Congratulations, General, well deserved." She turned, smiled when she saw him. "Admiral Kell, I didn't know you'd be here." He gestured to the saber she still held. "Wouldn't have missed it. You've earned every accolade they can give you, and probably a few they haven't invented yet." They moved away from the crowd, finding a quiet corner of the hangar where the reception was being held. "I got your note," Thorne said. "About the policy changes. That means more than you know." Kell shrugged. "It's a start. Probably doesn't go far enough, but it's something. I'm trying to make sure the next General Thorne doesn't have to fight as hard as you did." "There will always be fights," Thorne replied. "That's the nature of change. But if each generation fights a little less, endures a little less, that's progress." She looked at the saber in her hands, ran her fingers along the ornate engraving. You know what's funny? For all the awards and recognition, the moment I'm most proud of is teaching Riley to fly. That first time I took her up in a Cessna when she was 12, and I saw her face when we broke through the clouds. That's the moment that defines my life, not any combat mission or promotion. She's still flying? Kell asked. Riley, Thorne nodded, pride evident. She made department head last month. She's on track for command if she wants it, which terrifies me and makes me incredibly proud in equal measure. They talked for another hour, the conversation ranging from professional matters to personal ones, from tactical discussions to philosophical musings about service and sacrifice. Somewhere in that conversation, they stopped being Admiral and General and became simply Marcus and Evelyn, two people who'd stumbled into mutual understanding through conflict and growth, who'd learned from each other in ways neither had expected. When the reception ended and they prepared to depart, Evelyn stopped him with a hand on his arm. Marcus, thank you for being willing to change, to learn. It would have been easier to double down, to dismiss me as oversensitive or political. You chose the harder path, and that matters. Kell met her eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had haunted him for months, and smiled. You made the choice easy, Evelyn. You showed me who you were, and I just had to be smart enough to see it. They shook hands, a firm professional grip that nevertheless carried warmth, mutual respect, the beginning of something that might become friendship given time and proximity. Years would pass. Admiral Marcus Kell would retire with full honors, would spend his remaining time advocating for women in combat roles, would tell the story of General Evelyn Thorne at conferences and in interviews, using his own failure as a teaching tool. General Thorne would eventually pin on a second star, would continue flying whenever she could steal time from her command duties, would watch her daughter Riley rise through the ranks and eventually achieve command of her own squadron. And on a warm evening in San Diego, at a small ceremony attended only by family and close friends, now retired Admiral Marcus Kell would watch as Major General Evelyn Thorne received the Marine Corps' highest honor for a career of exceptional service. Her daughter Riley, now a commander, would pin the new stars on her mother's shoulders, and both women would cry, unashamed of emotion, secure in their accomplishments. Kell would approach afterward, shake her hand, and say simply, "You were right, pride was overrated." And she would laugh, the first time he'd heard her truly laugh, and reply, "But humility earned through fire, that's worth everything." The sky above them would be clear, dotted with the first stars of evening, eternal witnesses to human drama playing out far below. Somewhere, aircraft would be flying, carrying young pilots who'd grown up in a world slightly more equal than the one Evelyn Thorne had entered decades before. That progress had cost blood and tears, and countless small battles fought in ready rooms and carrier decks and promotion boards. But it had been worth it. Every struggle, every confrontation, every moment of doubt had built toward this moment, this recognition, this understanding that excellence transcended gender, that heroism wore many faces, that service demanded we see each other clearly, without the distorting lens of assumption and prejudice. Admiral Marcus Kell had learned that lesson on a carrier deck in the Pacific, from a woman in a worn flight suit who'd simply answered a question with quiet dignity. "Brigadier General, sir." He'd never forget it again.